Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to have a look at... Now there's an old saying, an old saying in military circles, and that is that amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. Now in spite of knowing this saying, I don't often talk about logistics because they have the propensity to be really boring. For instance, if you were to have a conversation and say, who was Napoleon's best marshal? Well, someone might say Marshal Ney, someone might say Marshal Lannes, someone might say it would be Massena or Kellerman, someone like that. For me, the one who absolutely is number one is Berthier. Without him, Napoleon was nothing, really. I mean, that's a little bit harsh, but he was definitely the man who made Napoleon the man he was. And it's telling that without him, at the 100 Days campaign, Napoleon lost. So, just saying. But, having said that, he was also in the 1813-14 campaign, and they lost those as well. But the point of the matter is, we don't often think about logistics when we're doing our war games. It might be something that we put into our campaigns, if we are lucky enough to be running one of those, but it's something that we don't usually think of when we're wargaming. Everyone turns up to the battlefield, they're warm, they're well fed, they're fully equipped, jobs are good in. Now, I have done a video in the past that's very, 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 very lightly touched on this when I did my video on rules for vignettes. Now, I want to do that again. There's some more vignettes have come out since then, and I want to make it a bit more formal. I might put a document together as well. But the point of the matter is that an army marches on its stomach and is only as good as its logistic train. Now, the reason that I think this is important in our war games is if we look at just the pure stats. I've said this before many times, the Austrians are far and away the best army in the game because they have their large regiments, because they fire an extra dice for closing fire. They are absolutely formidable when they're defending an object, or even when they're assaulting and being able to fire at close range before they go in. However, history doesn't really bear this out. Now, the Austrians fought bravely and they fought well, don't get me wrong, but they weren't as powerful as they are in the game of Black Powder. And that's okay, because you don't want the person who's collecting Austrians to have an army that can't win, so, you know, there's no problems with that. All I'm saying is that they don't necessarily represent everything, the gestalt of that army on the battlefield, on the tabletop, because there were other factors that happened off the battlefield. Now, I was thinking about this because some of you may know that last week we ran a Zulu war game. It was really Richie who ran a Zulu war game at the Other Partisan in Newark. And I was talking to him about how we'd played a similar game before. I'd played this with General Dad, and what we'd done is we'd said that the Zulus could lie down, and that the British they had a limited ammunition. We'll talk about that in a second, but they had to spend a turn reloading, so they could fire for 3 turns, and then they had to reload on the 4th turn. And what that meant basically was that you had short rushes of the Zulus as they were getting closer to the enemy. So I think it made certainly for an exciting game. And in the end, the Zulus won. But that was a good game. We didn't have that in the game at the Other Partisan. And to be honest, I think Richie was right. We didn't really need it. One of the reasons that we didn't need it is because when the Zulus turned up, the guy rolled a 3 for their order. So they zoomed 36 inches across the table, and they were right in my grill the turn they turned up. So, okay, well, fair enough. Them's the dice. And it also led me to, thinking about the games I've had in the past and things like that. And you may have seen some of the battle reports, and you may have heard me say that I'm fishing for a 6. So what that is for argument's sake, the cannon is going to have a shot at long range. All I'm looking for is to roll a 6 and try and disorder that enemy formation or something like that. I'm not really expecting to kill anyone. They might be in a building with a 2+ save or something like that. But all I want to do is just cause a 6 and disorder that unit. This is, of course, all well and good, but it's not particularly historically accurate. So the reason for that being, you've only got so much ammunition, you've only got so much powder, and you've only got so much battlefield situational awareness as well. We've seen a lot of video from modern conflicts where you've got drones. You can see all sorts of stuff. It's crazy, the things you can see these days. Obviously, in Napoleonic times, they didn't have that. Although I think they did use a balloon at the Battle of Montmartre. But balloons aside, they didn't really have that aerial view of the battlefield. And it meant that they couldn't really tell what was going on outside their direct vicinity. And for that reason, the battery commander wouldn't say, well, I'm going to fire at the units that's supporting this cavalry unit because the other cavalry unit that's behind the hill, I know he's sweeping around to charge them in the flank or something like that. So that would make it rather unrealistic. So what this is designed to do really is to have a look at ways that we can make it look like the armies have been marching on campaign and they're confronting themselves in this place, and we're going to fight the battle out on the table, rather than just two armies that have teleported from their barracks onto the battlefield. They're going to fight each other, then they're going to teleport back again. So the first thing that we're going to look at is how can we represent lack of supply on the tabletop. Now, lack of supply is not the world's most complicated term. It means that the troops on the battlefield haven't got all of the things that they would either expect or sometimes even need to be the most effective fighting force they can be. The most obvious ones in this are food, ammunition, and to an extent clothing as well. Now I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here because I want to talk about how the special rules work in Black Powder to do with psychology. Now, Black Powder is obviously written by Rick Priestley. He's got his, he cut his teeth writing Warhammer Fantasy. Now, Warhammer Fantasy is fantastic for all the different types of psychology that you have in the game. Most games will just have take a morale test. In Warhammer, there is a differentiation between fear and terror, for argument's sake, and those are both different from panic. And panic is different from frenzy or stupidity. So we have a whole raft of different psychological rules. They're all based around leadership, and they're all, roll 2d6, roll under your leadership, but they all have different effects. And that's the differentiation in the psychology there. Now, some of this has been moved over onto Black Powder. So, for instance, freshly raised is not the same as wavering, and wavering isn't necessarily the same as, say, stubborn. I mean, obviously they're different, but it's a different mechanic as well. So, wavering is that you take a morale test every time you take a casualty. Stubborn is you automatically pass your first test. So, a unit could conceivably be both stubborn and wavering as well. I can't really think of an example that would be the case, but you could have it because they are different effects. And it's really by delving into this richness of Black Powder that we can represent the different deficiencies that our units might have on campaign. So let's take, for argument's sake, the most obvious one, ammunition. In our Zulu wargame, this came up quite strongly. The Zulus charged, so the Gatling gun opened fire. And the way machine guns work in Black Powder is you keep rolling until you either miss or you roll a 1, which is a miss, in which case the machine gun jams. So that's what happened in this game. I hit twice and then jammed on the third shot. So, fair enough. Pretty standard for my luck. I'm just glad that I managed to hit twice. And this is what brought up the conversation I had with Richie about, is there a mechanic for reloading or anything like this? I'm certainly not a Colonial Wars expert at all, particularly when it comes to Black Powder, although I have read the Death on the Nile book, which is pretty good. But anyway, I don't think it's called Death on the Nile, but you know what I mean. The Mardist Uprising one. So the rule I am proposing for low ammunition is that when firing, if a unit rolls more 1s than it does hits, then it goes to low ammunition. Now, some of you old grognards out there might recognise this rule from a little game called Necromunda, which I believe used to be quite popular. And it's exactly the same rule. If you roll more 1s than you do hits, then the unit goes to a low ammunition state. When in a low ammunition state, you reduce 1 from your shooting value. And if you do it for a second time, then you could either reduce another 1 or you could just be out of ammunition. This again, I mentioned the vignettes earlier on, is a perfect reason to get your wagons out for the lads, get your carts out. They can be in the central battery store, and if they get resupplied by ammunition, they can fight as normal. Now, it's unlikely that's going to happen during the battle because you probably won't have time for any of that kind of stuff. But the options are there if you're playing like a massive battle, if you're playing Dresden, or Leipzig, something like that, and you've got millions of troops on the table, then you might be able to pull that unit back, get it rallied up, get it rearmed, and then get it forward again. So what kind of units would I suggest this for? Well, the first thing is obviously on a campaign level, an army that is conducting a fighting withdrawal, particularly where the resupply is not great. The most obvious example, it's probably going to be the most obvious example of all of these, is going to be the retreat from Moscow. So if you're fighting for, say, the Battle of Smolensk, then, sorry, not the Battle of Smolensk, the Battle of the Berezina, sorry, then you could apply this to the French there. But there are other examples as well. After the Battle of Maida in Italy, the French had to withdraw, and they were fired at by Italian partisans there. So if you wanted to, say, follow up with the British and fight a battle, then you could say that, due to the harassing fire from the irregulars, their supplies are not quite up to snuff. But it also happened for the Allies as well. And a really good example of that would be the retreat to Corunna. A perhaps more, shall we say, controversial option, I'm going to go with that, could also be in that it applies not necessarily to the whole army, but just to certain units in the course of a battle. Now, for me, the absolute prime candidates for this would be the defenders of Hougomont. They were famously quite low on ammunition. There was an ammunition cart that came down. They had to open the gates to let it in. And that was a bit of an issue, a crisis point there. So in that case, I wouldn't necessarily say that you just do it all the time. I would say that you only risk low ammunition perhaps after you fought your first hand-to-hand assault. Because that, you're going to use a lot of ammunition then, and then that's when the resources can start running low. And it also means that the French are going to have to commit to putting troops in order to trigger the chance that the firing could be a little less effective from the guards in the chateau. So that's a really good example, I think, of where you could do it. Another example, if you wanted to go for the French, could be the garrison of Aspern and or Essling. Or if you really wanted to look further afield, you could perhaps also include that, probably less so on the Abercrombie expedition, but perhaps on the Wellesley's army in the Battle of Assaye, something like that, although that would be a little bit far-fetched, but you could still extend it to there. So that's what I propose for having a shortage of ammunition, is that you either identify certain units or the whole army that is a risk of being low on ammunition. If they roll more ones than hits in a volley of firing, then they count as low ammunition. If they do it a second time, then they either run out of ammunition altogether or they lose another dice. I'll let you guys decide on that. I think running out of ammunition altogether might be a little harsh, but it depends on the severity of the retreat. I say retreat, it could be that they've advanced too fast as well, I guess. Now, I'm going to combine the next two together because I think these would have similar effects, and that is a lack of clothing and food. Now, the reason why I think they've got a similar effect on each other is that although they will affect you physically, I think the more important thing is they will affect your morale. I can assure you, having exercised in Catterick, being cold, wet and miserable is very, very not fun. And I think there's a number of ways that we can represent this. And again, I think that would probably depend on the severity of the privations that those troops are going through. So again, if we want to talk about an extreme example, we've got the retreat from Moscow. If we want to talk about maybe a medium example, we can talk about perhaps a retreat to Corunna, although that was pretty bad, to be fair. And if you want to talk about a lesser example, perhaps the retreat to Lisbon by the British, or maybe the French in Egypt, particularly after their march from Alexandria. So as I say, I think there are a number of different ways that we can have this. We can either... So I think the most extreme one would be to reduce the stamina of a unit by 1. Or, alternatively, you could start that unit with 1 point of damage on them already. Basically giving them a stamina value of 2 if they're a normal-sized unit. Now, be advised, this is going to be pretty harsh. If you've ever played an army, say the French or the British, who've got a stamina value of 3, and then you take on the Austrians or the Russians, who've got a stamina of 4, you will soon realise what a massive difference that makes. Similarly, if you reduce it from 3 down to 2, that will make an equally large impact, but just the other way. So I would suggest be cautious of doing that. You might want to do that with perhaps low quality troops in a very tough spot. So something like Neapolitans during the retreat from Moscow, something like that. But yeah, that would be quite harsh. Another one that is on paper quite harsh, but probably less than that, is reducing their morale save by 1. You could even do it it's reduced by 1 for the first, until they fail their first one, and then it goes back to normal. So for argument's sake, the 42nd of Foot have formed up on a retreat to Corunna to stop the pursuing French. The French go in, and they inflict 4 hits on the British. So he rolls the first dice, he rolls a 3 for argument's sake. So his first one would need a 5+ to save, he's failed that one, and then the rest will need a 4+, something like that. I think if you did it for all of them, that's again pretty harsh. Probably not as harsh as reducing the stamina by 1, but still pretty harsh. If the unit already saves on a 5+, then I absolutely wouldn't do that. So something like a Cossack, they save on 5s anyway. I wouldn't mess with their stamina. It's low enough as it is. Although that said, if your Cossacks aren't very well dressed or fed, then something's gone horribly wrong with that Russian army. So those are relatively harsh penalties, but if you are chronically underfeeding or under-equipping your troops, then it can be a major, major blow. Either alternatively or additionally, you might also want to reduce the hand-to-hand factor by 1, particularly if it's going to be a shortage of food. The clothing thing is not so much of a problem for hand-to-hand, but certainly if you are not well fed, your hand-to-hand capabilities are going to be a lot less than they would normally be. I wouldn't reduce their factor by any more than 1 though, so your standard line infantry regiment would still have their 5 attacks. This would have the additional impact of making the army less want to engage in hand-to-hand combat, which is pretty reasonable. You would want to try and keep the enemy at range if you're in that situation. Another thing you could do, and this would be less harsh, and probably the one that I would be most likely to implement, would be either -1 strategy rating from my commanders, which is the one I would probably go for, or have units unreliable. I'd probably go for the -1, because the thing is with the unreliable is, although it means you don't move as you get the same as the strategy rating, it doesn't change the thresholds for double and triple moves. So what I mean by that is, if you roll for example, you roll a 5 and you're a strategy rating 7, then even on an unreliable unit, that unit will get to move twice. If you -1 from the strategy rating, they'll only get to move once. That makes the units a lot more sluggish, and I think, again, really represents that they're not perhaps performing to the best of their capabilities because they're not as well equipped as they could be, either with food or their clothing, equipment, things like that. They might be a little bit slow to get going. Now, so far I have talked about these in relation to infantry units because they tended to be hit the hardest by these privations. I say that with a slight caveat, because I'm sure some of you now are thinking, well, actually, that's fair enough. The cavalry are hit hard as well. However, the cavalry tends to be in a slightly different way. With cavalry, it tends to be that the horses just die. So there's no that they perform less well than they otherwise would. Well, I guess they perform a lot less well than they otherwise would because they're dead. Now, when a horse dies, one of the pluses of that is you can eat it. In fact, I did hear that the reason that the French will eat horse was because of the amount of horse that got eaten during the Napoleonic era. Now, I don't know how true that is, but that is what I've heard, because here in Britain, we don't eat horse. Well, not unless it's been smuggled into a Tesco's lasagna, anyway. It might have been Sainsbury's, actually. But anyway. So for the cavalry, I would suggest, again, you look at that stamina hit to them, rather than, say, -1 to their morale save. I think a stamina hit would be more credible on them, particularly for heavy cavalry. Now, this is a weird thing that I once read. I read Anthony Beevor's Stalingrad book, and he talked about it in there. Was you would think that the big guys they would be the best equipped to deal with starvation because they've got a lot of muscle on them. There's maybe a bit of fat on them, things like that. And you would think it would be the same with horses. But this is not actually true. It's the smaller, wirier, lighter guys that deal better with starvation because their bodies don't require the same amount of energy that the larger ones do. So the heavy cavalry regiments would be hit particularly hard. I would be tempted to either knock their stamina by one, or if I was feeling really harsh, maybe even reduce the size of the unit by one step as well. So if you're normally a medium-sized Cuirassier unit, then you now become a small Cuirassier-sized unit. Or you could perhaps just have less units. So for argument's sake, you've got a brigade of 3 regiments of Cuirassiers. Well, now you've got a brigade of 2 medium-sized Cuirassier units because the third one's been folded in as replacements on the other 2. Light cavalry, I would probably deal with less harshly, and this is for 2 reasons. One, as I say, their horses required less intake, shall we say, than the heavy cavalry horses. But the other one is the light cavalry are the guys you send out looking for food. So those are the guys who find the food first, so they're probably the best fed, let's put it that way. But that's not to say that they didn't suffer terrible privation as well, because obviously they did. But for those guys, I would probably give the unreliable special rule to, particularly if they're marauders. It could be that it's not that they've not got the order, but they've found a field of turnips that they're digging up. I mean, that happened historically. Or they found, like, a couple of houses that they're raiding. Maybe you've not got that on the battlefield, because the collection of 3 buildings you got on the battlefield represents a town of 30 buildings or whatever. This might just be 1 or 2 Spanish peasant huts, or I don't know, Tyrolean inn or something like that. So we've talked about potential shortage of ammunition. I should have said as well that also goes for the artillery. The artillery should have that special rule as well. And we've talked about the potential for having troops without adequate food or clothing. I guess shelter would be the same thing as well in that. And the last thing I want to talk about is, it's going to bring us back to the Austrians again, but it's a bit more nebulous than the other things. And that is confidence. It's a difficult thing to quantify, and I've kind of tied myself up in knots about this in the past when talking about Waterloo. I'm convinced that the Army of the North went to its, what it would eventually be its final campaign, almost as a suicide run. I don't think they thought they could win. Maybe Napoleon did. I certainly don't think many of his more experienced generals thought they could win. Some of them didn't think they could win, so they stayed away. Marshal Soult, I'm looking at you. Other guys, I think, went along because they followed their emperor, but I don't think they ever really thought that this was a victory in the making. I think someone like Marshal Ney would do that. Now, I don't necessarily want to get into that discussion here, but armies, groups of people, they often have a mentality of things. Success breeds success. If you look at even something like football teams, can be a really good example of this. If you go on a run of victories, you expect those victories in the next game. Similarly, if you have a run of defeats, then you expect the next game to be a defeat. I think something like the Battle of Wagram is a really, really good example of this. The Austrians had arguably beaten Napoleon at Aspern-Essling. I think you could argue that they did, or that Napoleon drew the battle. I think you could possibly argue that. But if we say that they retreated, therefore it was an Austrian victory, then they should have been riding high, but they weren't. Archduke Charles ended up getting removed from his position as the head of the army. The army then went back to its much more linear tactics, standing on a hill at Wagram, and the French just absolutely rolled them. And I think this was in part because the Austrians didn't think they could win. They already had done, so they knew they could, but they had this lack of confidence that meant that they weren't willing to fight the French on their own terms and ended up surrendering the initiative to France. So this is a little bit of a double-edged sword, this one, because I think if you feel like you're going to lose, then the army's going to have some negatives. If you think you can win, or if there's perhaps an outside reason that you think you should win, then they should get a bonus. Now, the most obvious example of why you think you should win is in the Russian section of the Clash of Eagles book. They all have stubborn, they all have that 4th stamina, and that is because, they were fighting the first great patriotic war, although it wasn't called that at the time, but they were fighting on the soil of sacred Mother Russia. They were fighting for what was right, and all that good stuff. It'll be interesting to see that when we get the 1814 book, whether I'm still alive or whether I've died of old age. But it will also be interesting to see if they keep this. I suspect they probably will. Or if once the Russians go on the offensive, they are a little less stoic, shall we say, in their self-belief. I should declare an interest here because this is an idea I've been thinking about for some time now when working on my Black Powder 1914 rules. With the 1914 armies, particularly the Germans, interestingly, but also to a lesser extent the British, in fact to a much lesser extent the British in 1914, maybe more so in 1916, there was a belief in the war's going to be over by Christmas, all that stuff. I mean, it's a bit more confusing with the British, but with the Germans, they had this idea that, schools almost enlisted en masse. There was a battle called the Massacre of the Innocents where the German troops actually linked arms to advance towards the French because, they thought it was going to be this glorious thing. I'm sure as soon as those Saint-Etienne machine guns opened up, it was a very different matter. So you can use the rule freshly raised for these, which is nice. It gives you a good option of not really knowing the capability of your troops, but I think that's a little bit too swingy. So what I would propose is troops who are in high spirits, they re-roll their first unsuccessful saving throw. So they keep going with that re-roll until they fail it. So it's a little bit like I said when you're on a 5+ until you fail one. On this one, if you're high in confidence, high in spirits, then you're on your normal 4+. You could even say it's +1, but I prefer the reroll until you lose that first point of stamina. It's to use a term from the Glory Hallelujah book, it's seeing the elephant. It's knowing that you're in a battle now. Things are getting serious. It's a lot easier to be confident of your victory when the guy's head next to you hasn't been taken off by a cannonball, let's put it that way. Now, the flip side of that are troops who think that victory is unlikely. Now, you could give them the wavering special rule, as we've already mentioned, but I think that could be quite harsh. So what I would be tempted to do is invent a new special rule. I haven't thought of a name of it yet, so pop down in the comments below if you have made it this far through the video and you can think of a name for this rule. And what it would be is it's a break test when you get shaken. So normally units take a break test when they get excess casualties, but in this case you would take one when you get shaken. If you think that a battle is not going to go your way anyway, then once you've taken some casualties, you're probably going to be more likely just to write it off as a bad deal. Another slightly more innovative but probably more complex to actually remember on the battlefield would be to limit supports. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, when you have hand-to-hand combat, you can often have +3 to your combat resolution because you are supported on both flanks and to the rear as well. Now, that relies on the troops who are around you to be willing to put their lives on the line to help the unit that is currently in hand-to-hand combat. I know that supporting is just a rando number here, but it does mean, getting in close range, shooting at them, or maybe doing a limited bayonet charge, something like that. Maybe even folding troops forward into the formation that's in front of you as men fall. So you could say for an army that's perhaps less confident in its victory, it can only get perhaps +1 or maybe +2 to their combat resolution. Now, I think that's a bit more elegant. I think that would be cool, but I think it would be harder to remember in the heat of battle. So I would recommend for this one troops who are less confident of a victory than they... And again, this can be for a number of reasons, and it could also be in addition to things like the rules for not having enough food or whatever. Although I tend to find in those cases that sometimes it can be a bit of a last stand vibe going on. But so my recommendation would be when you are shaken, you take a break test then, or morale test, and you apply the results that come on from there. Now, speaking of the Austrians, and this is one that's just come to me while I've been recording, so this one's even more off the cuff. But I was also thinking as well about having a lack of trust in officers. Now, this is certainly something that could apply to the Austrians, less so to pretty much anyone else I can think of. Particularly is suitable to the Austrians due to the polyglot nature of their regiments. So you might be a Croat who speaks Croatian, and your officer is German, who speaks German, obviously, and you might have to translate through like Polish, Lithuanian, down through Bosniak, and then finally to Croatian or something like that. So it's difficult to get a rapport going with your battalion commanders when that's the case. So you might say if a unit has a lack of trust in its officers. Now you could also do this as an individual special regiment rule, and which incidentally I'm going to do a video on in the future. So again, pop in the comments below any regiments that you think should get singled out for almost like special character stats. But yeah, so you could do it for units that you think would be unlikely to have the full confidence in their officers. Then they can't rally off the first 2 points of their stamina that they lose. So again, that might work well for an Austrian unit, particularly a Hungarian Austrian unit, but it wouldn't necessarily jam with how the Hungarians performed. So I don't know. That one I'm just putting out there as a bit of an idea. But there you go. So those are 3 examples that I think we can look at logistics, things that happen outside of the tactical sphere, off the battlefield, that can affect troops on it. Now, I've not talked about weather because there are rules for weather in Clash of Eagles. Whether they're good rules for weather or not is, we can do a video on that later, I think. But if you've got any ideas for any other ways that you can look at how the impact of these things can be on troops, then let me know in the comments down below. The key thing really is, when we set up our war games, we teleport our troops from the barracks onto the battlefield, they fight, and then they teleport back again. We don't really get the campaign mechanics going on. Now, they can either be specific battle special rules, or they can be something in your gaming group that, the classic, they've captured a colour in the last game, so they get +1 to hit with their close combat, or they get tough fighter, being tough fighter, something like that. So it's just ways that we can look at maybe adding a little bit more, and I'm using the term advisedly, realism into our games. But thank you very much for listening to my cold-filled ramblings today. I hope you got something out of the video. As I say, I want to do a video on special regiments, so please leave a comment down below for your choices of special regiments. I mean, there's ones that have got special rules already, like, I don't know, the Old Guard Grenadiers. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, this line regiment, the 24th of Foot, have this special rule or something like that. So pop those down in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you guys next time.